Can you hear me? Good morning. We'll go ahead and get going. I've got 9:30. I want to thank Bert for lining me up on this and get going. And I want to say good morning to you and to those watching by Facebook. And we're going to pick up kind of where we left off. I'm going to get right into it because I'm going to finish up today. We're going to get from before the rapture, and I'm going to get you into heaven and see what's going on for those that are left behind. But last week we talked about Russia is going to invade Israel at the end, toward the end, and they and about 8 or 9 other countries are going to invade. They're going to come from the north, east, west, south, and God. We're going to see how God intervenes. But I meant to tell you this last week because God has intervened throughout history to preserve Israel. But we saw this in our day and time in 1967. I want to just read something real quick to you. Israel's Six-Day War of 1967. Now, this is Dr. Jeremiah talking. It stands today as the most spectacular modern example of God's punishment on those who curse Israel. Of course, we talked about last week, if you bless Israel, God will bless you. If you curse Israel, God is going to curse you. And so we see the results of that. But in 1967, I remember this, the United Arab Republic, along with Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Palestinian guerrillas combined to attack Israel from the north, south, the east, and the west. The Arab armies numbered 500,000 men. Israel only had 75,000. The Arabs had 5,000 tanks and 900 aircraft, whereas the Israelis only had 1,000 tanks and 175 planes. When the smoke had cleared 6 days later, the United Arab Republic had lost their entire air force and 20,000 lives. The Encyclopedia Britannica labeled it this way. It was a disaster. Egypt's casualties numbered more than 11,000. Jordan had 6,000. Syria had 1,000. And Israel only lost 700 men. So there was over 18,000 casualties to 700. So that's a ratio of 20 to 1. So God intervened them to take care. And the whole point of this is, and I went back and read Ezekiel 38 and 39 this morning and a little bit yesterday. Go back and read that and see how that applies to Russia, because it talks about Gog, G-O-G, being the leader of the Russian Federation. And we don't know who that is, don't know at what time that's going to be. But God is going to punish them. They think they're going to be real cool. They want to come down and invade Israel. They want to take its wealth and kill its people. They want to just wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And God is encouraging them to do this. This is what's so unique about it. He's leading them in there, and He's going to punish them. But Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about God intervening. He's going to come in and just literally annihilate them. There are going to be all kinds of calamities. Dr. Jeremiah talks about the largest earthquake ever to be recorded will occur. He said it's going to be so bad that even the fish in the oceans will feel the effects of it. He said every living creature, he said birds that are roosting in trees, he said the mountains in Israel are actually going to fall. The buildings are going to tumble all over the world. The greatest earthquake that will ever be recorded. Military confusion is going to happen as all these millions of men come from the north and the east and the west and everything to invade Israel. They're going to come in there. God is luring them in, and He's going to punish them. But they're going to turn on each other, just like what happened in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. in King Jehoshaphat. The enemies, they just turned on each other. In the night, they just started killing each other. And same thing's going to happen to this. They're going to turn on this. He's going to cause a disease to break out among all of these attacking armies. If you think COVID is bad, COVID is not going to hold a candle to this. Excuse me. But there's going to be multiple calamities. These countries, and I think I mentioned them last week, it's Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, some of those Stan countries in Central Asia. They're going to send these armies into Israel along with Russia. And they're going to sit back and think, okay, all the fighting is done here. I don't have to worry about that. But in Ezekiel, it talks about God is going to send fire and brimstone, just like He did on Sodom and Gomorrah. And He's going to hit them heavily. He's going to destroy their countries. The destruction is going to be so bad that in Ezekiel, God invites the birds and the beasts to come feast. There's going to be so many dead bodies, so much for them to feed on, that God is literally going to command the birds to come from all over the earth to feed on these carcasses. All the wild beasts in the surrounding area is going to come in and feed. The army is going to just be completely destroyed. Now, if you read Ezekiel, it talks about, because there's been a lot of debate on this, a lot of confusion. If you read Ezekiel, it talks about it's going to destroy the horses, it's going to destroy the chariots, it's going to destroy their bow and their arrow and stuff. Well, that's not applicable to today, because obviously we don't fight with bow and arrow and chariots and stuff like that. But Dr. Jeremiah points out, he said, he put this in that context, Ezekiel did, because his readers of that day would know what it was about. So, if he said, well, he's going to destroy all the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and all the jeeps and stuff like that, they wouldn't know what he's talking about. So he puts it in the context of the weapons that they had that day. So you fast forward a couple thousand years, the principle's still the same. But it's going to be so bad, there's going to be so many weapons left on the battlefield when these Russians and all these other folks, when they're all killed. Ezekiel says it's going to take Israel 7 years to burn the weapons. There's going to be so much, the landscape is going to be littered with so many weapons, it will take them 7 years to burn them all. It's going to take 7 months for them to bury the dead. Imagine that. There's going to be so many dead people, millions of people, all over the landscape of Israel, that it's going to take 7 months for them to clean the land up. Okay, we don't have to worry about that. All that's going to come after God pulls us in the rapture. The rapture happens like that, blink of an eye. It's the Lord calling all the believers into Himself. It comes, as we've talked about before, it happens before the 7 years of the tribulation, and it happens prior to Jesus' second coming. I've got a comparison here. I was going to do a handout on this, and I'm not sure the book would even pick it up. But at the rapture, Christ comes in the air. On the second coming, Christ comes to the earth. At the rapture, Christ comes for His saints. At the second coming, Christ comes with His saints. At the rapture, the believers depart the earth. At the return, the unbelievers are taken away. At the rapture, Christ claims His bride, which is the church. At the second coming, Christ comes with the bride. At the rapture, Christ gathers His own. At the second coming, the angels gather the elect. At the rapture, Christ comes to reward. At the second coming, Christ comes to judge. The rapture is not in the Old Testament, but it's predicted often in the New Testament. In the rapture, there are no signs. It is imminent. As I said last week, Dr. Jeremiah thinks that 1948 set the stage for the last days before Christ comes. But there are no signs. It is imminent. But the second coming is portended by many signs. The rapture is a time of blessing and comfort. The second coming is a time of destruction and judgment. At the rapture, it only involves believers. That's you and I. The family is taken to heaven. At the second coming, it involves Israel and the Gentile nations. At the rapture, as I was studying this, at the rapture, only the believers are going to see. Only the believers are going to see Jesus. Non-believers won't see this. But at the second coming, it will be visible to the entire world. At the rapture, the tribulation begins. At the second coming, the millennium begins. At the rapture, Christ comes as the bright morning star. At the second coming, Christ comes as the Son of Righteousness. So there's a comparison, comparison between the two. But the rapture is, as I said a while ago, the rapture is a signless event. There's nothing for you to look at and see, okay, well, it's going to happen tomorrow or something like that. No, there are no signs. It happens in the blink of an eye. It is a surprise event. No one knows. Many have predicted, I can't think of the gentleman's name. I think it was a Russell. The gentleman that founded Jehovah's Witness, he predicted that the earth would be gone in 1914. Of course, it didn't happen. And then he backed up his calculations and said, it's going to happen 10 or 12 years later. That didn't happen. So no one knows. No one knows. But it is a selective event. The rapture is. It only involves believers, you and I. It is a spectacular event. It's the sound of the Lord's command. Dr. Jeremiah compares it to when you remember when Jesus went to Lazarus' grave and hollered for Lazarus to come forth. He said that's going to be a very similar comparison. That Christ is going to come in the air and He's going to call those who believe Him, the sound of the trumpet. The rapture is a sequential event. The Lord, as we said, the Lord Himself is going to come. And we talked about earlier, your body is in the ground. Your soul is with Jesus in heaven. At the rapture, your soul will come with Jesus. It will be joined in some miraculous way to your new body, and then back to heaven, so to speak. And all this is in the twinkling of an eye. He'll bring with Him all the souls who died as believers. I'll paraphrase something he said here just a minute. This talks about death. The Bible views the death of believers as a temporary suspension of physical activity until the believer awakens at the rapture. Just as physical sleep is temporary, which is a temporary suspension of physical activity until one awakens, yet there's no suspension of mental activity. I guess you'd call that a dream. But, what your mind is functioning while you're asleep. Well, so is death. It is a temporary suspension of physical activity until one awakens at the resurrection. There is no cessation of spirit-soul activity, only physical activity. So your body, your physical body, is in a sleep mode. Your spirit is very actively going on with Jesus in heaven in that state. So it is a comparison to sleep. There have been, and I didn't know this, and I just didn't look at the terminology on it, but there have been 4 raptures that have already occurred. The rapture of Enoch in Genesis 5, the rapture of Elijah in 2 Kings. He got on the chariot of fire. Jesus was raptured. In Acts, it talks about Jesus ascending from the mount to go back to heaven, and the angels said, "Hey, why are y'all standing around looking at Him?" He said, "This same Jesus, you saw Him leave, He's going to come back the exact same way." And then the rapture of Paul that we talked about, where Paul was caught up into the third heaven, and and came back. So there have been 4 raptures, so to speak. There are 2 more raptures to occur that have not occurred. The rapture of the church, you and I, when the rapture comes and all believers are taken with him. And then over in Revelation chapter 11, it talks about the rapture of the 2 witnesses. There, at the end of time, there are 2 witnesses that prophesy a bunch of things, and they're allowed to prophesy for 3.5 years, and then the beast or the Antichrist or whatever kills them. God breathes, they lay in the street for 3 days. God breathes life back into them. They're raptured up to heaven. So there's 2 more raptures to occur. All this happens before the tribulation. The tribulation occurs right after the rapture. It's an unknown time, so to speak, but it's the worst thing that will ever happen. Dr. Jeremiah says the Antichrist comes on the scene a little bit. Now get this, those of you that have studied history a little bit, he said you put Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and some others, you put all them together, and all 4 or 5 of them together is not going to be as bad as the Antichrist. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad when you look at all the things that they did in history. And he said they're not going to hold a candle to the Antichrist. The purpose of the tribulation, it's going to purify Israel, because we get into a little bit about that when God allows all these Russians and all these others. It's getting rid of them. In fact, Dr. Jeremiah talks about in his book here that God is so fed up with Russia because of what they've done to Israel through years, centuries and centuries, and how they have profaned the name of Christ, and they've been really the instigator in a lot of the world's problems against Christians, and he's going to punish them so in that battle that I talked to you about. But at the same time, he's going to purify Israel. It's going to punish sinners. Of course, a lot of people think there, as we mentioned before, the perspective on the tribulation, some think post-tribulation, mid-tribulation, or pre-tribulation. Dr. Jeremiah takes a stance of pre-tribulation. In other words, he's saying that the rapture, all those things are going to happen. Then the tribulation will come for 7 years, and at the end of the 7 years, excuse me, at the end of 7 years, we'll have the second coming in the 1,000 years of peace. The Bible says that the church will be protected. He has a little discourse on this. I'll just give you some why he feels this way. It says throughout all of Scripture, we see God protecting His people by removing them from His judgment against the evil that surrounds them. As I mentioned, Enoch was transferred to heaven before the judgment of the flood. Noah and his family were safely enclosed before the judgment. Lot and his family were taken out of Sodom before judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. The firstborn among the Hebrews were sheltered before judgment on Egypt. The Israelite spies were out of Jericho before the judgment fell on that city. So he talks about time and time again God protecting His people. And the protection is apparent throughout the book of Revelation. The church, you and I, which make up the church, we are mentioned 19 times in chapters 1 through 3 of Revelation. From chapter 4 through 19, the church is never mentioned. Never again. So He comes down, He takes us. We go with Him. The church is spared all this terrible things that's going on. But I think the point in this whole book is for us to see how God has used Israel, His chosen people, how He's used it throughout history to accomplish His will. And we see how different things have happened and Israel's rejection, and God always came back and forgave them and brought them back. And then in 1948, He brings them back from all over the world after a terrible war where over 6 million of them were killed. He brings them all back and sets the stage. And His word is being fulfilled daily. And as I said, that when 1948 occurred, that validated the Bible. God said, that's what I'm going to do. So in 1948, He did it. That validated the Old Testament. And it makes the Quran a mute point. And that's what makes them so angry, because it disproves the Quran and proves the Bible. And so we see time and time again how God comes in, saves the nation of Israel, blesses those who bless Israel, curses those who curse Israel. Now, I just showed you that, I read those statistics to you a while ago, but I think now they're still outnumbered militarily about 20, 25 to 1. Population-wise, the same way. They're very, very, very small in comparison to everything. And God is going to allow all these things. They're going to think they're so good to come in. They're going to run over Israel and destroy them. And God's using that. He's going to make, Israel has got no hope left. No hope left. They're being overrun. And God has really just lured them into a trap. And He destroys them. He wipes them completely off the face of the earth, punishes them for their rejection of Israel, for their trouble that they've caused for centuries to Israel. And in Ezekiel, God says, I'm going to show you my wrath. I'm tired of my name being abused. I saw someone put on Facebook this week, and I think it's I don't always agree with a lot of things that's on there, but I saw this as a good point. With everything going on in the world right now, he said he thinks, whoever put this article on Facebook, he thinks this is God's greatest altar call right now, trying to get us now. Because he said, the world is getting ready for the Antichrist at some point in time in the future, maybe in the near future. The world is getting set up for the Antichrist. God is setting us up for the rapture. He's setting us up for His Son to come and take us with Him. And then all these things that we've gone over the last couple of weeks, all these things are going to come after we're gone. I rode, let me close with this. I rode for the better part of 30 years back, 4 years of college and 30 years of TVA, so a lot of driving between here and the shows, but a lot of mornings I would listen, WQLT, radio station, I would listen to it, and there was a gentleman on there, and I always liked, he was a Church of Christ preacher, I always liked his little devotional. He said, a story he told, he said a dad and his boy, senior in high school, sat down to talk one day, and the dad asked him, he said, son, what's your plans? He said, what do you mean? Son, what are your plans? What's your plans for life? He said, well, I guess I'm going to graduate high school. And Dad said, okay, then what? He said, well, I guess I'm going to go to college, get a degree. He said, okay, then what? He said, well, I guess I'll get a job and start building my career. He said, okay, good, then what? He said, well, I guess I'll try to find a wife and start a family and go on. He said, okay, then what? He said, well, shoot, Daddy, I guess I'll work 30, 35 years and retire. He said, okay, then what? He said, well, I guess I'll play golf and goof off till I can't. He said, okay, good, then what? He said, well, I guess I'll die. He said, okay, then what? Then what? That's the question we have. Then what? So it's imperative, I think, that we as believers recognize the severity of what's going on in the world, but not to throw our hands up and panic and stuff, because we're taken care of. We're taken care of. What we've got to worry about is our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, what they're going to face. I'm not sure we're leaving them a very good world. But, I don't know, brother. I've heard Brother Gene say several times, he thinks probably all these things are going to culminate in the next 50 to 100 years. Who knows? I don't know. But you see all the signs that are taking place. As I used the example when I first started, when you pour things into a funnel and they go around and around, and as they get toward the bottom of the funnel, they get going faster and faster and faster. Well, that's kind of where we are in the world, I think. We're getting faster and faster and faster to we're ready for the rapture. And I think God's setting us up for it. Listen, I appreciate your attention. I've enjoyed this. It's been 2 series about angels, and then this. I've enjoyed it. I hope I've not confused you. I hope I've not made you think I'm crazy. But I appreciate the chance to do this. I know next week tables will be set up in here. I don't think we're going to have Sunday school next week. They're going to have the meal for the youth fundraiser. But I appreciate your attentiveness and the comments I've heard afterward. I appreciate the kind words. I thank Bert again for getting me on. I wouldn't even know where to start, Bert, but appreciate it. And so, anyhow, I hope I've shed some light on some things, just kind of like Paul, when God allowed Paul, and not Paul, but John in Revelation, where he let him just kind of pull the curtain or bend the blind a little bit so he could see the things that were going to happen into the future. And John didn't write that for his own benefit. Jesus told him, he says, write this. This is for me and you. This gives us an idea of where we're going and what to expect when we get there. We've got a roadmap to get there, and when we get there, there's certain things we're going to be doing, and that's what this is. I bought this at Books A Million. If I could plug a book, I would plug this one. You can get it on Amazon or at the bookstore. It really makes you think. I have just really skimmed it. I've taken a little bit out of each chapter. I've skimmed it real fast and tried to bring to you the highlights of things. But let me encourage you to buy it and read it. It will open your eyes to see, as he says, as time ends, he said, don't look to Washington. Don't look to Moscow. He said, look to Jerusalem. That's where it's all going to be. It's all going to be in Jerusalem. Look to Jerusalem. We're not even mentioned in the Bible. And nowhere you'll find the United States mentioned. We're here because we've blessed Israel. We're the ones that stood with Israel, and God has blessed us abundantly. Just look around. Just look around this morning. I appreciate your attendance. Let me, real quick before I pray, let me just mention a couple of these. I've got